Welcome to our Saturday morning Dungeons and Dragons show. I'm your host this morning, Sir Lucien from Sir Lucien Gaming, and Jordan, who is normally my co-host. Jordan, that's PH is silent from YouTube and Twitch. He is currently on vacation, so I had to bring in a very special guest, which you can see on the screen. I brought in Jim Murphy, who's going to sit with us and talk all about gaming and RPGs, and I think we're going to have a really fun discussion. Jordan will be back next week, and we'll have another good show, and don't just keep signing in. We're going to always bring in more guests. You guys got to see the Matt Colville interview. You got to see Lex Mandrake's interview, and Ben from Questing Beast. We've already bringing in really good people to talk about GMing topics and stuff, and I think we're going to have a really good session this morning. So if you got questions, you can put them in over in the chat area. I'll try to keep an eye on it as I can, but I think we're just going to jump right into it. So Jim Murphy, I would love and want to say thank you for joining our show this morning, but if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit and just where we can find you, and a little bit about what you do right now.
Hey, good morning. I guess good afternoon to some of your guests. Pleasure to be here. Yeah, I got into this a few months ago doing the social media type event. Previous to that, I've been gaming for 40 some plus years. Right now you can find me on both YouTube. I also have a Twitter feed. All of it is Jim Murphy at Game Methuselah. I also, you can get me on Reddit if you need to. I'm working on a bunch of different projects, but mostly, like I said, I've been just getting involved, following the lead of what everybody else is doing and talking about my over 40 years of experience in gaming, trying to get people into painting, building miniature collections, and getting out there and role playing and then DMing games, because it's so much easier. If I did a recent video on the minimalist DM, which is me. I mean, I've basically been able to whip games up very quickly and provide lots of content lots of times because I was the only game in town. But I enjoy it, and I'm glad to be here to talk about gaming. So
awesome.
Got any questions or anything about it?
Yeah, I knew one of the things that I one of my first questions I was thinking was, tell us where the Game Methuselah part comes from. How'd you get your Twitter handle? How'd you decide to come up with that? What's the story behind that? Because there's got to be a story.
Well, Game Methuselah came because 20 some years ago I opened 3 retail hobby shops. And I was 39 years old, so, you know, it was no big deal. I was a young guy, had lots of energy, had a real job. And I wasn't looking to make money. I was making lots of money in the industry, but I just wanted to open it up with game stores and in-store gaming, which really didn't exist a whole lot at the time. And as we did this, everyone kept calling me the old man. It was just like I was way older than everybody, and I found that kind of sad. But eventually, Methuselah, which is the old man who lives forever, which is what I'm trying to do, and continues on, became my moniker. So a lot of times you'll find it on games. You go on to various games like WoW and things like that. My moniker has always been Methuselah. And thusly, as I started talking about the games, I just came with the Game Methuselah moniker.
I love it. That's really good. So there's a really good interview out there with you and Matt Colville,
Yep.
You being friends with Matt Colville. And I definitely recommend people go and watch that too, because that's really where I kind of got my first introduction to Jim and really thinking, oh, I really would love to talk with this guy and really kind of dive into some of the things that were interesting. We won't probably cover a lot of those same questions because obviously you can go watch that interview, but there will probably be a little overlap. So I think both are good. Go check out Matt's interview on it. And I know Matt has been saying, even in when we had him on the show, on our Saturday morning show, he was talking about he was definitely going to have Jim more on his channel as he's getting his studio thing set up. Jim was going to be a prominent member, so I know we're going to get a lot more of Jim, so it's going to be great. But yeah, I know one of the things they talked about is that that I wanted to go into the story of a little bit was, so the very first time you play an RPG. But before we say that piece, I really want to know what was going on right before that. Like, what was the big gaming that Jim was doing? How did you interact with it? I think it was something like you were working at a game store at the time as a young man. Was that true?
Right. Yeah. I came out of the hobby in modeling. I was an IPMS member, made historical models, painted historical miniatures. And there were monthly meetings and tournaments and events, and that's what I would do. I would bring my stuff down, everyone would go ooh and on, I get a trophy. That was what was very common in the 70s. But I had game. There was Avalon Hill Bookshelf Games at the time, and this was back from the 60s forward. And there was like American Heritage, and there were some other game companies, and they made different board games. And I had played lots of Monopoly and, all the things that everyone plays growing up. And I loved games, always did. So I really got into the games like Panzer Blitz and Richthofen's War, and these games made by Avalon Hill. And then I found SPI games, and they made some science fiction games. It was really fun. And a hobby shop opened up in Lakewood, California, near where I lived. It was called the Military Shop. And I walked in, and it was like a dream paradise. They had models, and they had games, they had everything I was into. And so, hey, you need an employee? And they did. And I went to work for them. Well, none of those people knew anything about games. They all were modelers. They were militaria collectors. They were historians. So they said, does anyone know anything about this gaming? And I said, well, yeah, I do. And they said, you're now the game store manager. So at the age of not quite 18, I became the manager of the game store. And thusly, I did everything, and I just delved into gaming. And the more I got into gaming, the more I realized, hey, I don't just need to make models and use them in a thing and then put them on a shelf. I can paint miniatures and make models and then use them in these games. And that's what I did. And I had the greatest time. It was a great time. And then what I would do is I had it as a sort of clearinghouse for gaming. People would come in and they said, oh, I want to play this. And I'd write their name down. I had all these clipboards. So if you came in and you wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons, I said, well, I know 3 groups that are playing. Give me your name and number, and I'll get it to them. And then I'll put these groups together. So I was putting all these groups together in gaming. And I joined in a couple of them and just kept playing. And I loved it. And modeling kind of went away because no point in painting miniatures to never use them. I get to paint miniatures and put them on the board and play with them. And so like all kids, to play with your toy soldiers, no matter how old you get.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering too, because like if you talk, if you talk about game stores these days, it really is a store that could be based around gaming, and maybe even a comic book store might be the same piece or that. But it feels like back in those days, in the 70s, like I'm a young kid too. It was a model shop. It was a hobby shop then, right? Did they have the trains, the models? That was the shop, and they had the games. Right? So it was kind of that type of a.
This shop was not, and it was just starting out. There's 2 shops here in Southern California, one called the War House in Long Beach, and then the military shop, sadly gone, which was in Lakewood. Both of those shops were changing the perspective. They were going away from railroad, and all that. There was no railroading. There was no, rockets. Well, I guess that came later, but there was really not the hobby end, no slot cars, none of that. What you had was just gaming and historical miniatures, and historical models. So Hasegawa, Tamiya, all of them were really big at the time. So lots of people were into the historical end. And then they would go and get involved with like IPMS, International Plastic Modelers. That's how you got into the hobby. There really wasn't. It wasn't until Dungeons and Dragons came out, which really originally started with a little supplement in the back of their chainmail. And there was a set of miniatures by a company called Der Kriegsspieler, and they made this whole Lord of the Rings set of miniatures that we had. And I just sort of put the 2 together. Well, wait a minute, you got the miniature game with the fantasy, and you got the fantasy miniatures. So I started to put them together, and it grew so very fast. We had a con up in San Jose where a lot of people from the D&D folks, Gary Gygax came out, and a bunch of people in a brand new company called Ralpartha that was trying to get their miniatures on the market came out. And my boss set me up, to the con, which was great. So I went up to join in and play with Dave Arneson and everybody. And he gave me the company credit card and said, if you see anything we should have in the shop, go ahead and get it. He thought maybe I'd buy a couple $100. So I came back with about $3,000 or $4,000 worth of merchandise, which he was sort of like, oh my God, what did you do? You spent all this money. And I put it up in the shelves and I set it all up. And on Friday, I put it up, and by Sunday, 90% of it was gone.
Oh, nice.
And my boss thought I was brilliant at that point. So then I could do whatever I wanted. And thusly, we became a big mecca for what was the local hobby Dungeons and Dragons scene at the time.
Yeah. So it starts out with how much experience did you have in chainmail at the time then? So, because that's really the precursor to the D&D, like you said, pamphlet.
Very little. I owned it. I mean, I bought the pamphlet. I owned it. It was medieval. So I was slowly building an army. which was, because it's an army game, and that was the whole idea. Because understand, Dungeons and Dragons was never expected to be their big moneymaker.
Mm-hmm.
This was just a supplement that they put out that then people said, wait, we want more of this. And then they had to figure out what the heck to do. I mean, Dave Arneson, who I had lunch with many decades ago, I asked him about the D&D game system. I said, it's a strange system for man-to-man combat. He goes, well, it's Civil War ironclads. And I'm like, what? He goes, yeah, we didn't have a game system ready for man-to-man combat. So I adjusted our Civil War ironclads game system that we were going to produce and turned it into a man-to-man combat system. And that's why armor makes you harder to hit in Dungeons and Dragons. Because, most Civil War ironclads just moved up next to each other and just fired.
Right.
And it was not so much whether you could hit them, because you were going to hit them. It was if you could hit them sufficiently to do damage to them. Yeah. And thusly, they've been stuck with this system ever since. And
that's great. Yeah. And so let's talk about, I know your very first experience running. Now, did you play in a game for Dungeons and Dragons, or did you run one first?
No, I played. First. I had no idea. First. I generated characters, and my girlfriend and I, and two other friends of ours went. Another couple went to the first game with Dave Arneson, and I think there were 20, maybe 25 people there in 3 different games. And you've heard the story when if they watch Matt Coville's, you'll hear the story about my girlfriend who ends up with the highest level magic user in Southern California. But we played, and everybody fell in love with it. And so we played the following week. And at that point, it was great. But now people are like, I don't want to wait till next Friday. Mm-hmm. Gee, I wish we could play a game now. And so, the girlfriend asked you, can you run a game? And I'm like, yeah, you bet I can. And I sat down and just looked at the charts and figured it out. And I got sort of the bardic spirit. So I just produced a game, and we were off and running.
Do you remember the storyline of that one?
The first thing was fabulous. But,
Do you remember what your story you came up with for that? Like, do you remember even what you were thinking at that time?
I generated a dungeon because that's all you had at the time. It was basically kind of like what people call murder hobos now. I mean, it was basically, there was a dungeon. My dungeon was called Maelstrom. It had this whirlpool of evil down below, and that was the whole thing. Now, I had never drawn any of this. I had only drawn one level of the dungeon. And then they had a random generator, and I generated the monsters and put it in there, and everyone just sort of kicked in the door and killed the monsters and collected the treasure. The stories evolved as it came, and because it was kind of an open system, the world, you went from one place to another. So we were going out to Caltech to play with those people, and we were playing at Lee Gold's house in Long Beach. So you start playing with various different people at the time, and you start grabbing, very much like I'm sure it is today. It's just we only had a very limited group of people. It wasn't the tons and tons of people playing nowadays. But it's a much better situation now. There's a lot more opportunities. You can even play online with players if you don't have a group. You can obviously go online. I think, like you were talking about, you do is have groups that you play with on Roll-D20 or Fantasy Grounds or any of those. They're all good systems that you can sit at home and play with people in foreign countries. It's fun.
Yeah, so. And the interview you did with Matt really has a great story about that 3-game, going to that house and playing. I recommend you guys go and listen to that story because it was a really fun story. You put a lot of details into that. When's the first time you switch from D&D and start playing maybe something else RPG-wise?
I would say D&D ran solid for about 2 years. So you're looking more than likely into 1977 until there were really other things out there. And at that point, I found a game called Chivalry and Sorcery, which I really liked. I played that. It had less appeal. And then they started to come in en masse. There was Steve Jackson put out a little folio game called Wizards, and then called Melee, and then later in a supplement called Wizards, which I sort of modified and adopted and made it a role-playing system, even though it wasn't. And then later he came out with a role-playing system. And there was all kinds of things that they just kept coming in. And I'm sort of this, if something new comes in, I want to play it and I want to read it. And then I would say, hey, this is great. I mean, I loved RuneQuest. Everyone else hated it. There's a lot of games. I loved Empire of the Petal Throne, the Tekkamil thing that Barker came up with. That was based on D&D. Really loved it. Played it. Found some people who played. Would go anywhere I could to play it. But, there's just lots. And I sort of got away from D&D, not intentionally. It's just because I was sort of leading the way with different game systems that I felt were more detailed, more combat oriented, more miniature friendly than Dungeons and Dragons was. Because a lot of people were doing theater of the mind, but it never went away. I mean, I always played. I just played less of it.
And you were a big you liked. I think I remember you talking a little bit. You liked fourth edition quite a bit, right? So we go through.
I loved fourth edition.
Yeah.
I was so sad that I think Matt Colville and I, and maybe a handful of other people, are only the people who actually loved fourth edition. I still think it was the best that they've done. I think fifth edition is much more of a throwback to third. They're trying to simplify it. It even almost seems much more like D&D 0 in a lot of ways, where it's being simplified, and it's good. I'm running it currently right now, so I'm piecing through the rules, and it's all reasonably good, and it's much better than it was. And I would recommend, if you're playing new, you should always start with Dungeons and Dragons, just for the greatest reason. Because some people ask me, what my favorite game system is, and I always say, well, the one everybody's playing. It's no point to have really great systems, and there's some out there that nobody plays.
Yeah.
And I can there's a game called Dragon Quest, which my friend Don loves beyond anything, but you got to buy the rules on eBay, and then you got to find people who are willing to read it, because it's gone. It's been dead a long time and not likely to get resurrected, since it's owned by Hasbro, and I don't think they let go of anything.
So it's interesting too. I know you do a lot of conventions. You go and do a lot of convention play. You're even talking about, like, you've hosted stuff. You've been part of groups that are hosting events and things. And
right, yeah.
How do you feel?
HMGS PSW is the big group I'm involved now, which is historical miniature gaming. And in October we're having another game convention, and it's all based on historicals. I might, if things change, I actually might do some historical D&D. I might run a D&D 0 event there, because I have a lot of miniatures, and I obviously have a lot of history with Dungeons and Dragons in the original format. But I'm trying to avoid that if I can, only because we're trying to do historicals, and historicals and role playing have always been at odds with each other.
Well, I know one of the things that we love to do on the show is really talk about stuff that can help new GMs, and you're definitely a longtime GM, and you've even done some videos where you're starting to talk about differences between GM style, how to get into GMing, to really help out other people, just like I think Matt Colville has done a great job inspiring new GMs.
He's done a fabulous job.
Inspired me as a new GM, and the newest video you have is the Minimalist GM, which I really liked, and I like the idea that you talked about what the differences were between those couple of styles. And, like, tell us a little bit about your style currently as you run a game. I think is just a way to give us a good footing. What is it like to be in a Jim Murphy game right now if we're playing some Dungeons or Dragons or whatever system it happens to be?
Well, I've got a reputation of being a pretty deadly dungeon master. I've trashed a lot of parties, and I think it's an unfair reputation. I tend to make a very challenging game, because to me, if there is no drama, if there is no great risk and feeling of that you could be decimated at any moment, and this last Thursday I ran a game that came very close to wiping the party out, and fortuitously, they kind of rallied. Their spirit sort of broke, and they were kind of running for it. And then they kind of rallied because they realized they weren't going to get away, and they were able to save the day. And it was exciting. I think they had a good time. But I think the thing for me is, again, like, I think when Matt did his last prepping video on prepping for his new campaign, he asked people, how much of the preparation do you do is for you and how much is for the gamer? And he said 80-20, which I thought was perfect, because that's true. Most people over prepare their games. I tell new DMs, the secret is make a little adventure, come up with a hook, please go save my pig, or, some children have been kidnapped, or it could be anything, whatever you want, but just have the first adventure ready. And then maybe in that first adventure, the leader of the goblins, which was what happened to me, the goblins are getting beat and the leader runs away. And I had named him Bogan Redcap. And this character then dogged the heroes for decades. I mean, I'm not lying. He's been in every game system I've run ever since. He's sort of this ongoing protagonist who shows up and tries to foil whatever the adventurers are doing. And this all came because of a throwaway adventure I ran with a throwaway hero leader, a monster leader that didn't die, and thusly you can build your leaders. And I've told this to new people, just let the game take its own course. Do something simple, use what you have. If you have a module and use it, maybe add a little to it. and then let the players lead you where the game goes. Now, don't tell them this. I mean, God forbid, I don't want to out myself to all the players that I usually do mostly, I would say 50% to 60% impromptu gaming. In the video, in fact, we had lunch with Matt the other day, and he even mentioned the dwarves who went off their adventure and went into the gnomish bank, and I had to do this whole adventure out of my head instantaneously while I'm racing through the stuff to figure it out. And Matt goes, God, it was a fabulous game. He said, could you imagine if we had that on video? Because I think that really was a changing moment for all of us, because I don't think up to that point, everyone in our group at least didn't realize you could just wing it. I mean, you could just come out, run a sandbox game, and who knows where you're going to go. And I tell people in the video, you got to prep for that, though. It's not something you just do. So I prep up all kinds of creatures. I have a little 3x5 card box I usually have with me. So if somebody says, I want to go over here, it's like, yeah, no problem. You just do it, and you pull something out, and you figure it out, and you know what the CR, if you're playing Dungeons & Dragons, they make it easy for you. Because once you know what the CR of the group is, the challenge rating, you just know what you pick. So you can open up a book and say, this is a CR1 creature. You had so many of them to get to the point mix, and you can just run it out there. And if you prep it in advance and just have these random encounters, you can put together a whole adventure completely out of your head. And I think it works faster. I think in many times it's much better. And your players don't need to know. I mean, Matt disagrees with me on this. He says, you absolutely never tell the players that you're winging it, because they're going to get, they're going to feel like, well, you didn't care, or you didn't put in the detail or whatnot. But you make a list of names. I mean, I did that because, Matt used to get mad because he's like, well, what's the NPC's name? I don't know. I didn't make a name for him. You make it up. He didn't like that. So before an adventure, I write down 50 names and have them ready. So you run into somebody, it's like, oh, what's his name? And it's like, well, Sid's his name. And it's like, oh, okay, good. There now, that you have this.
Yeah, and I think
you can wing a lot. It's a lot easier than people think. Just use what you have. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of videos out there that help people, brand new people that want to GM or DM, get into the thing, and they hear about prepping and how much it is. But I think a lot of times they don't necessarily hear what prepping actually is. Like, what are you talking about when you say I spend 20 minutes of prepping? What am I actually prepping? Because like for me, when I prep, when I'm playing an online game, might be slightly different than what you prep for your game that's more of a sandbox and something that you're coming up with. And it might be different for the person that's running a module, because I know like Matt likes to run modules. Even though he tweaks them and he changes them, he likes different modules and he likes to run those. And I think the prep for those are slightly different, though there are very many similarities to it. And I'm not sure that has gotten out. And I think that's why lots of people go out and look for videos when they talk about prep, because they hear how much time they have to spend, but maybe not necessarily exactly what we even mean. Like, what is prep for you? What are you doing? What does prep really mean to you? What are you prepping? So I heard monsters.
I'll handle it in a couple avenues.
Yeah.
When there's modules involved, I find the modules to be the longest prep time, because you have to read the module at least once, often more than that, to kind of gather what's in there. So you might have a situation where you'll spend hours reading through the module, and then when you're playing, half of that's gone out of your head, so you're having to go through it. I played a lot in the living games, Living Greyhawk in 3.5, Living Forgotten Realms in 4th edition, now Adventure League in 5th, and I've been a certified game master in all of those. And I find that when I play in them, and then when I am asked to run the same adventure later, most of the game masters never read the modules. They didn't know what they were doing. So they ended up just sort of throwing the monsters out there willy-nilly. Normally in my games, I know what the story is. And since I use maps and dungeon tiles, I'll often lay it out ahead of time and look at it. So I'll look at my map and I'll understand what it looks like and what I want it to look like. Now, there might be some variance when I actually play, because as I'm putting it down, I might grab the wrong tiles or not put them down in exactly the same order, but I have a rough idea. I usually generate 2 random to 3 random encounters, wandering monsters, and those could be anything, from 1 or 2 displacer beasts wandering around hunting for food, and you come up with a motivation, and that's in your brain. The motivation for, like, I had 2 displacer beasts in a recent encounter, which kind of was above the party level, but they weren't going to stay. If they couldn't get an easy kill, they're going to run. So they come in, they're dangerous. Everybody's terrified because they know 2 displacer beasts can trash the party, but they put up a good fight and they bloody one of the displacer beasts and they bail. Now they get the victory, so they get the experience points if you're using XP, or they get the success or whatever, however you're rewarding. But it changes the game, because that concept of, you fight the monsters till they're dead, that never happens. No one ever fights almost anything of mine until it's dead, unless it's an undead. Most everything, when it starts to lose, runs. And that's the way it should be. But you can throw nastier stuff at players in the prep. So my prepping is I generate some random encounters. Then I generate 3 main encounters, which are going to be in the adventure. So there's the preliminary, the guards, and then there's whatever they run into, maybe if they make a left turn, a cleanup crew or something. And then there's the big bad and his minions. Now I know where they're at in the dungeon, but I don't have it spelled out. I know what the dungeon looks like because I've thought it out in my brain, and since it's my content, I know, like, if I'm running my Albion, it's mostly all elven ruins and stuff. But if you keep it simple, like I said, my prep time under an hour for a whole adventure, and that makes it much easier for me to do other things. And then you come, and the minute you sit down and play, your players throw a monkey wrench in your preparation, and you're suddenly making a left turn.
Yeah.
That's where you have to be free thinking about what they're doing. So suddenly you pull a random encounter down, and that now becomes a main event, because they've changed your game, or they've come in the back door, so they go right to the main event. And Matt does this a lot, where they call it I think they call it the Coville screw. I used to say, you just walk into the main entrance of a back Coville dungeon, you kick the first guard, and don't do anything else. Don't worry, the whole dungeon will come to you. And I have a Murphy orc trap, which I'm legendary for. But that's it. Keep it simple, keep within what you're doing, and then build your campaign from what the players react to. Now, I have much more grand ideas, but I've been doing it a long time. But you can start much simpler and just get a game out there. Your players are going to love it, because they're going to think there's much more. Just always allude to something. The good thing to do is pick a story type. If you like, you were talking about Forgotten Realms. It's really, really in depth. I mean, they've got, mechas of detailed, areas and everything else. All you have to take is one village in a remote area, and you could be running games for years and really never get out of that, that locale. You'll never even scratch the surface of all that core information they've given you.
Yeah. And what is a typical what is a typical session length? Because I think that's another thing that new GMs and DMs are struggling with to understand. When they listen to other people's advice, it doesn't necessarily come out. How long is the game you're planning for? Like Matt's game might be a 3-hour, 4-hour. It might be an 8-hour marathon game. And that's a little bit different than if you're like, I do a lot of 3-hour style games, because I kind of run from like about 8:30 at night, try to get them done before midnight so everybody can go back to work and all that. So my games are about a 3-hour session. So like my prep is kind of like I'm probably at 2 encounters instead of 3, because that's about what I can fit in. And I've started to learn what I can fit in a certain amount of time. What's a typical, when you're prepping, what's the length you're thinking your game is going to go?
I try to prep for the 3 to 4 hour game as well, under normal night situations. So like Thursday night, I had prepped a game which I thought was 3 hours. It was 5 hours. And fortunately, these folks are game designers, so they're hardcore. So they were all willing to stay to the end, even though it was a school day and they all had to get up and go to work the next day. But it depends. Like on a Saturday game or a Sunday game, which I'll be running for the pad group, we'll get together at 9 o'clock, and it's not uncommon for us to run games to 6. So, but it may be multiple encounter. It might be multiple adventures. They might finish the first adventure in 3 or 4 hours. They come back to town. They have the reward interaction period, and they're like, "Are you ready for another bit?" And I'm like, and I'm always ready to go. So it's kind of like, "Yep, we're off." And then suddenly we run a second adventure. You got to gauge it. I'm getting better at gauging my night games, because those, obviously you have to keep controlled if there are work nights. Yeah. But we used to play Friday nights at Dave, Miles' office, and we'd get there at 6 and we'd play till 3. I mean, so it just depends on how crazy you want to be. I think the 3 encounter, the 3-hour games came from a lot of the living games, and they're smart. The idea that you can get a game in a reasonable period of time. Often what happens to me is there's more story. So a lot of times the pathos of what's going on takes more time. The Druids they rescued these children in the first adventure. And the Druid elders decided, well, wait a second, these guys are tainted by some dark, horrible thing, and we might have to try them. And if we find them, that they're tainted, we're going to have to burn them. And the players didn't want any part of this. So then it's like, well, you have to go do this mission and get me this thing and prove that, this device, this magic relic will prove that they're tainted or not. Well, and so the players are like, well, this is all BS, but we know we got to do this or these kids are going to die. So, it's driving the mission. You want a story that, here's the dungeon. You can go down and dungeon crawl if you want. I got a nice big dungeon here with lots and lots of treasure. Or you can go save these kids. What do you guys want to do? And it's like, oh, I want to save the kids. Of course they do. That's the point. You give them a hook of something that you don't, it's like, hey, don't worry, you don't have to do this. You can go here, we can go down and run the dungeon. And they're like, no. And so that's what you want to do. You give them little breadcrumbs that can lead them where you want to go. Now, always have, like I said, always have a dungeon ready, just a hack and slash, because a lot of people just want to do that. They just, oh no, we don't want to do that. We want to go, kill some goblins and get some treasure. That's great. But the other is where your story and thusly your campaign is going. Where Colorado the Vile, I think, was Matt's thing. He stole out of a 4th edition module, and that dude haunted us for a godly amount of time, because he just kept using him over and over again until he became his guy instead of Dungeons and Dragons guy. So, did that help?
Yeah. And I know one of the things, a term you use quite often that might, with all the new people coming into the hobby, because right now, I think I just saw an article that talked about D&D is at its highest it's ever been. It had like a 40 or 50% growth even over last year. So even last year was big and enormous for the hobby, and other games were doing great too. This year was even bigger and better. So there's all this new influx of people coming in. We use terms sometimes that I don't know if a lot of our videos are explaining, like living campaign, because I don't know if a lot of people know what is the difference between what is a living campaign versus I go buy a module or I just play a game that I built that's homebrew that I use. Like homebrew, we're starting to get into the lexicon. So I think people are starting to understand that means you make your own content that you're going to play at your table, homebrew. And I know people understand what a module is. You go buy a module, it's already a pre-designed adventure or campaign that you can do things. But Living Campaign doesn't have a lot of videos out there based on it. So I know you know a lot about them. You've done a lot about of them over the history. Give us a little rundown of what's the difference between what a Living Campaign is versus running the other styles of games.
A living campaign is a lot how Dungeons and Dragons originally started. I mean, there was no framework. So if you generated a character and you played and I played in your game and I went from first level to second level and then you suddenly moved to Idaho, I'm like, what am I going to do? I've got this cool character I like. Well, I go over to somebody else's house and I said, hey, I got a second level character, and they'll let you in their game. And thusly you play on. So I traveled all over Southern California with characters and generated them in everybody's game. That quickly ended. People kind of got into what they kind of control thing. Well, I want my own world and you can't take your character out of it. And that still permeates a lot of gaming now. Wizard of the Coast realized this is a problem. So they came up in 3rd edition, I guess 3.5, with Living Greyhawk. The idea was you could go play in this game and at the end of it, they'll give you experience and stuff. And thus you can take that character to some other place, like a con, a game convention always has living games going on. They'll have Adventure League, which is the current 5th edition. And you can come and play in that game, and then you can go play at the next one at a local hobby shop, and they let you take this character from one point to another. It's always a game to play. It's a great way to get into the hobby if you don't have anybody who DMs. Find a place that's doing living games and go jump in. I'm working on that currently with my Albion campaign. I was real successful with it. I love the background. I'm working on a source book that I'll likely kickstart, or I'll run it through Matt's company, depending on how the logistics work for him. But in the meantime, what I'm going to end up doing is setting up a living campaign online for that, where if you're part of, I guess it's going to end up doing it through Patreon, but if you're ended up a Patreon DM, or if you're working in my DM group and you get all my adventures that you're taking, using, or modifying, if I've got a guy here in California and you live in Texas and he moves to Texas, he comes in and says, hey, I've been playing in Jim's living game. I know you're running it. I want to be in your game. And it's like, yep, you're in. That's what living games are. And I wish we could get more of that. I think a lot of times people get isolated where they're they're in a situation where, they're playing characters and then their game devolves and then they go, oh, well, it's over. I've invested all this time and it's lost. And that sometimes has been my disappointment. And I mentioned that on Matt's video. I've got some great characters I've run over many decades that, they're great stories, but I can't play them today because, they're not in the living genre. They're just in the house genre. Yeah. And I think we'll see more of that. I think if I get my product out, I think you'll see, I know Wizards is doing it. I know that Pazio, I think they make their own system because they were running the 3rd edition. They have a living version as well. I super suggest it. Now, they might call it something else. Everybody else has like a nice hook. But the thing that they're doing is called Adventure League, and you can find it in most shops, wherever you're at. And if not, just look online, type it in, and find out where they're playing it. And you're going to find someplace, hopefully within driving distance, that you can get into a game, right now.
Yeah. I'll be one of your DMs on that, Albion. That sounds good. I'll join your Patreon for that. When you get it out. That'd be great.
Yeah, I think it'll be fun. I mean, because I also want to show people how to do it simply instead of there's a difficult way. And the other thing about what I wanted to do is I don't want your game to be the same as my game. So if I give you a module, it'll be like, okay, here's my module or my unmodule, as I would like to call it. This is how I ran it. But I would suggest you could look at these other 7 or 8 options, or make up your entirely different option, but the basic storyline stays the same. And that's what you get in a living game. You get a continuous storyline, and more importantly, your characters can advance down this storyline. And I think it fell apart, like I said, late in D&D, because what happened is you'd have players who come and play in your game, and they get to be 4th or 5th level, and they had a great time, and then they disappear for the summer, and then they come back at the end of summer, and they say, hey, I got a 15th level character now. And you'd be like, yeah, what? It's like, well, yeah, I played like 3 times a day, every day for, the last 6 months. You're like going, oh, okay, whatever, and that's why I think that Death Knell, the living game, started, is people didn't like that fact they couldn't control who was coming in and going out, and people would show up and it's like, oh, I have a Vorpal sword. And it's like, well, nobody in our group has anything more than a +1 sword. How did you get a Vorpal sword? Well, this guy gave it to me in this game we played, and you're like going, okay. And that's why that sort of died. But I think it can make a reoccurrence with just very minimal controls. And that's what Wizards does. They keep minimal controls on the game, and it makes it work.
Yeah. Well, I know some games, too, have a problem of level disparity. Not all RPGs are 1 to 20, so you don't get this situation where one character comes in and they, just like you said, I have a 15th level and the other 3 people have 3rd levels, and now you're trying to figure out how am I gonna, I want them to adventure together. I never want to say, hey, we can't play because you guys don't have the right level character, you don't have the right like if they're willing to come to my table and sit down, I want to be able to play the game no matter what happens. So I think that's one of the things that living campaign helps to fix, so you're not worrying about time constraints and letting people come in and out and allowing the party to change more dynamically than it does now. I think we really get set into this. We have our 5 players and it's only our 5 players. And now when somebody asks about, hey, can I play a game? He's like, well, I've really got my 5 kind of group. That's about what I can do. Right.
And then they're out the door, and then, then they maybe don't play. They moved on to something else. And you've missed out. I mean, there's a lot of diversity. Almost all my good friends that I've got acquired in the last 40 years, I would say 95% of them came out of gaming. And if they didn't game, I sucked them into gaming, so, and you end up becoming personal friends with these people. And I have a large cadre, and I play a lot of different types of games. The disparities in levels, I think people, like I said, I'm getting into milestone leveling, which I'll likely for sure use, because at the end of an adventure, you just give them, that was half a level, or that was a full level, or, whatever amount is, so that if they go to someone else and play who's in your living game, they know how many living adventures are out there. So that they can pretty much know how high maximum a character can pretty much be within a give or take. But people are weird about that disparity. We used that a lot in old D&D. I mean, it was not uncommon to have a 9th level character running with a 4th level character. The 4th level character was sort of sucked on because he knew he was getting a whole lot of experience at the end and likely some nice magical items, because the high level characters weren't going to need them. So they were like, yeah, you can have this +2 sword. So it was a way for them to build their characters up and keep their risks down, because, you're not carrying the weight. If you're a 4th level fighter, the 9th level fighter is likely carrying most of the weight. You're just there to make sure that his back is covered. And and that worked. I mean, we didn't have a problem with that. I mean, we would have characters running in all different levels, and that would work a lot. But now people are like, well, he's a level higher or whatever. So, I mean, I don't know whether I can even run in that game. And that I think is a mistake. But
yeah.
It's common wisdom where everybody wants to stay the same level. We had a guy miss one of our last games. He was a level lower than the group. And at the end of the adventure, they said, well, let's just brevet him up to our level. Is that okay? And I'm like, well, I'm not going to argue. I mean, this is what they want. I'm willing to, obviously include it. But I find no problem in running, game disparity, level disparity. Because you can cheat it as the DM, and Matt's talked about this, where, the monsters don't really pay as much attention to the lower level fighters as they do to the high level, because they realize this guy's really not a risk. So the big monster doesn't go over there and kill the second level dude. He goes and fights the eighth level fighter, and that, maybe if you stumble in and hit the second one of the monsters, it might give you a back slap, but for the most part, you give them a slap, and that works. I mean, a tail slap from a dragon's likely going to be sufficient to knock out a second level character. So that's all you have to do. You don't need to concentrate on them and try to kill them. And my reputation as a killer DM is unfair. I'm a drama DM, but the point is I'm always rooting for the characters, but you don't want to be the DM who the characters think you're out to get them, because as the DM, quite frankly, I can boule them at any time I want.
Yeah. I think it too, a little bit of it. It's funny because I believe up until like probably D&D 3rd edition and all the games that came before that, those were games that were based on the games that came before them that were role-playing games, and they were iterations of that. But we finally get into like 4th edition and 5th edition, and that time frame is when computer games begin to influence how RPGs are being made, versus before that it was RPGs maybe influencing how computer games are made. And I
completely agree with that. A lot of people will say they think 4th edition is more like playing World of Warcraft than playing Dungeons and Dragons, which I think was one of its big knocks and one of the things that people didn't like. I've heard various different complaints. I have a friend who says that a lot of these modern games are the death of imagination because they do everything for you. It's a pre-formed route that you can follow, that you don't get to make it all up. When we played the fantasy trip, there was no two characters that were the same ever, because there was no format. There wasn't a bard's, format, a fighter. It just depended on what skills you took and how you put them together. Yeah. They're trying to do that with 5th edition a lot more, because if you saw some of the newer modules are coming out with more different types of bards or more different types of different things. So it's a problem. I mean, understand these people need to pay a mortgage. So they're trying to get you to buy stuff and utilize their product and get you excited with their game and get you playing. And they're being very successful. But don't lose the track of making it your game. And if you want it to be a certain way, play that. I mean, my group in Pasadena, we never played Dungeons and Dragons. We always are playing, Dragon Quest or Fantasy Trip, and these are highly modified versions of those games. But we've made them our game to suit what we like.
Yeah.
DMs should always do that. It used to be in the DMG that the dungeon master could do anything he wanted. However you want to change this game to suit what you do in your game system, please do it. That's what the game is made for. These rules really are kind of just format. They're just kind of an outline of how things could be. But people start to take it as canon, and then it's like, well, that's not the official way the rule works. And then you get into rules lawyering and all that. And a lot of times the cooperative storytelling goes away. What you end up with is just, I know this game better than you know this game, so then it deteriorates. And nothing worse than pissing off the DM, because they're like, okay, fine, you're going to be that way. I don't need to run a game for you. I mean, I've got plenty of other places I could be. So
yeah, and I think that's that holdover too. We get that a little bit of attitude of everybody needs to be the same level, or you have your group. Like online, when you play those games, you get into your groups, you get into your friends, and you don't maybe diversify as much. And the hobby's about meeting all kinds of people and playing with all kinds of people. That's how it started. It was like you said, it was a house full of 3 games being run at one time of all kinds of people, versus just a 6-player group that meets everyone. Not that that's a wrong way to play, but getting back to a little bit to that root. I think we're moving back there. I think during the late 90s, 2000s, we were getting really insular again a little bit just with but now I think that diversity is popping back out again, and a lot of people are getting back in. We're making our games accessible, and everybody's.
And I think the living games helped a lot in that, and the fact that they were always at cons. I mean, I tell people if you don't have anything going on, go to a game convention. I mean, it is a great place to meet other players. And, people are like, well, what do I do? And I said, you look at a game that you like and you walk up and say, can I play? And they're going to go, well, ham and hon. I said, well, if I can't play here, where can I go play? And eventually I say, sit down, come on, we'll teach you how to play. And now you're in the game. And thusly, some of them can find out, hey, these guys are cool. These guys are nice. I like them. Here, let me just exchange phone numbers or emails or whatever. And we don't live so far apart. That's how I got it. That's how it all started. I mean, I just went places, met people, and, played them. And then after a while, I had phone numbers. So on a Friday night, I just start calling people. When I got 10, I said, okay, we've got a game. And who knows how many showed up. We'd get 6 to 12 people would show up to play. And it was game on. And that's how it went. And it was always fun. And I like that. I mean, it shouldn't be 6 people hiding in a closet because they're afraid that people are going to find out they're geeky D&Ders.
Right.
I mean, I had an advantage that I had a really hot-looking girlfriend, so any place I went with D&D, nobody was going to think I was a nerd because I'm running my D&D, and she's got her wizard next to me playing. Everyone's like, okay, this is cool. So,
that's good. So
I like seeing that in pop.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's why I went to my first, when I decided to be a GM was only 2 years ago, and I just went to Gen Con. I had never been to any of the game cons ever. I just sat down and I said, I'm just going to go to Gen Con. I'm going to play games. I'm going to meet people, and that's how I'm going to find a way to get into groups and stuff. And I am never looking back. I'm going this year. We're setting up our trip. We got people going with us. We're hosting games. I'm running games for like Monty Cook games because I'm doing a bunch of Numenera stuff, which I love, and I'm doing stuff for Magpie Games, Dungeon World, and a lot of those powered by the Apocalypse
There's so much
RPGs.
good content out there now. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. So right now, like, we've talked a little bit about the past, and I know Matt's video goes a lot into the past, and we've talked a little bit about the present, but where do you feel like the hobby's at right now? Like your overall general feeling of how the game hobby, the tabletop RPG is right now. How do you feel about where it's at?
I have a lot of positive feeling about it because obviously my recent interaction, obviously on the social media, going back and forth, has been super positive. People are really, really receptive. I kind of think they think of me as Obi-Wan Kenobi, where I'm the kind of the old Jedi from the gaming world. And in many ways, that's true. But going to cons, there's so much you can do. There's so many games, so whatever your genre like, whatever you want to play, it's there. It's up to you just to grab onto it and start playing it. And role-playing is nice. I think Matt and Matt Mercer and a lot of these people have changed the format of gaming and made it more accessible to a whole different group of gamers. Many more women playing now than were ever playing back in the day. And I had a mixed group that was 50-50 when I was playing in the 70s, but we were unusual. But I love to go now, and I found, I think there's a group on Critical Role, which is almost all women that are playing. And I like that. It's a great diversity in gaming, which we didn't have. And the more diversity in gaming with the more different types of people playing makes the game better. And thusly, with people being able to go online and directly interact with the content producer, like they directly interact with Matt, and he produces, what do you want to see? I want to see this kind of streaming. Then it's like, great, we're going to show you that. And then teach you how to play. I mean, I told Matt from the very beginning, the best thing he was doing was not trying to be a celebrity, but trying to make it accessible to everybody else who wanted to play. Because that's what I try to do. I try to say, look, people say, I wish I could paint miniatures like you do. And I said, look, I'm not a good painter. I have a golden demon, but I'm a mediocre painter at best. But I'm fast, and I can do a nice job quickly. And I can give you 70% of my skill just by watching me paint, doing a little bit of stuff, or letting me sit down and paint with you for a little while. And from then on, you decide how good you want to be. And again, with the miniatures, you have the pre-painteds now that are available, and those you can just touch up in a couple minutes and make them look beautiful. There's so much more out there than I ever had access to. And I'm excited by it. And then you go online, find a game format you like. You're playing, if you just want to play, roll D20, it's there. You can be gaming tomorrow, today. If you want to just go online and look for a group.
At the end of this show, we're
yeah. I mean, it's fabulous. I mean, there literally is less time to play than there are options to play with. I mean, in the old days, I had to fight hard to get a game together. Now I could more likely play Dungeons and Dragons 24/7 if I wanted to, type of thing. So
and still be wanting to play other games. Like I'm having the problem now that I'm running so many D&D games, but I have other games I want to play. I want to run Numenera. I want to run The Strange. I want to run all these other ones. I don't have time anymore because they're a 4-hour game.
It's astounding. It really is. It's hard. It's like the whole thing. I'm trying to figure out a way to monetize this to a point where I can just provide game content and play.
Yeah.
And just a nonstop, because as you get closer to the end of the tunnel, you obviously become aware that the most valuable commodity is time. And I tell people, do it now, especially when I have a friend of mine who are in the game industry. And when I had my shop, they were obviously children. They would say, well, I really want to be in the game industry. And I said, well, go for it. Always go for it. Whatever it is you want to do, try it now. You can always fall back and do something mundane or boring. But if you stay on the path and do what you want to do, no matter what it is, even if you fail, you're going to fail at a level that's more than likely successful. You may not get to where you want to be, but you're going to get to a level that you didn't even dream about when you started. And that applies to everything, and to me, I've always loved gaming. So I just stayed with it and I just outlived everybody. It was just a situation that there's just so much out there. And I've met so many people over the years and I've had such a nice immersive, feel in the game that just go for it, and don't limit yourself to, I want to be a computer gamer. I mean, the funny thing about it is Matt's last 2 jobs have been for computer game companies, maybe the last 3. Matt's a board gamer. He's a tabletop and role-playing miniature guy, but he ends up as a writer for a computer game company because they're the ones who can write him a paycheck.
Yeah.
But he sucks them in and then gets them all playing board games and miniature games. And thusly, all those people at Turtle Rock are helping him get his dream of tabletop and board game and role playing games alive. And that's what he really loves. I mean, he likes computer games, so do I. But that's not our first passion,
Yeah.
You can date the other girl, but your first girlfriend's always your best. So
yeah, that's what I feel like right now. We're in that time of diversity is getting better and better. The number of quality games that are out there that you can find to play is increasing. Like there was a time in the 80s when it really there was a lot of RPGs coming out, but it didn't necessarily mean it was a lot of good RPGs coming out. There were, there was lots of things being tried out or different and everybody trying to make their mark over D&D and didn't quite make it. But nowadays you can find some really quality stuff happening now. You get lots of players. You can play with somebody that's in Australia. You can play with somebody that's in the UK. You can get buddies together that you were military friends with, or you went to college together and now you can get back together. I mean, this time is this weird renaissance. I like to think of it as gaming has come back, and computers, I think in the 80s and 90s tried to fill that hole or that void a little bit that some of us had, where if we couldn't find a group or nobody's schedules ever worked, what were you going to do? Well, I still want a game.
World of Warcraft, baby.
So yeah, it's as close as I'm going to get. I'm going to dive into it. I like it. I can level my character up. I get new abilities. It's cool. But it's also like tabletop caught back up again. Like they finally threw off their shackles of we're only going to be tabletop or we're only this. Let's start appealing back to that crowd and bring back those gamers, because there's millions of gamers.
In a lot of ways, I think it's the younger people who did it. The people who loved the hobby and did not want to see it go away. And what you had is you had a lot of the more curmudgeon-y type. And we run in that in historical gaming a lot with the HMGS thing. There's still some curmudgeons out there that say, well, if it's not historical and it's not a miniature game, it shouldn't be here. And you're like going, so you want to be the Scotch tape store. You want the business to go away. Look, everything leads into something else. If I teach you to play bolt action World War II and you like it and you play it, and thusly you're caught in, and then maybe that Napoleonic game with 2,000 figures looks bitchin'. I'm over playing with Dana Hone and his 2,000 points, his 2,000, English Civil War game. You get sucked in. Or maybe it's just Frostgrave, or maybe it's, something else. There's so many good things. Osprey produces all these little mini books on all kinds of very cool games that you can play, and it broadens your spectrum. And like Frostgrave, my friend Don and I were saying, this makes a great driver for a role-playing campaign. I mean, that's what Albion was. I used a board game that I love the color in the board game, and I adopted a whole role-playing campaign that plays now for over a decade, almost 2 decades, using that color. Now, not the game, but all the color that was generated from that game. There's so much of that out there. And that's what I tell people to do. Grab something you like, a book or a board game, or like I say, grab Frostgrave and look at that, read it, and then suddenly go, wow, I'm going to run a campaign based on this format. And boom, you're off. And then just pick your game system. I recommend you play a game system that everybody else plays. I tend often not to do that, but I have that option because I have lots of
a good player base.
gamers.
Yeah. I like the idea too. I used to play Armati, and we played Dawn Patrol. We played all those BattleTech back in the day. Oh god, we loved all those miniature games.
Love
them. Good stuff. So we talked about a little bit of the past. We talked about the present, definitely, and we're already getting close. When you asked me, we were on just before the show went live, and he's like, "How long do you think we'll go?" And I'm like, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, but then an hour goes by, and it just feels like in a minute or two. I'd love to finish off with what do you think, using your crystal ball, Jim Murphy, the future? What's coming up that has you super excited? Is there something you've heard about game-wise, or there's something, like you said, you want to talk a little bit more about your living campaign, or where do you think the hobby's going in the future now? Let's look ahead of where we are a little bit and say, what do you think's what's interesting that we should keep in mind and keep an eye out for?
The only thing I keep waiting for, and I've discussed it for quite a while, and I start to see it coming, sooner or later, someone like Blizzard or any of these companies, or maybe it's just going to be some young guys who figure out how to do it, are going to produce a very high-powered, high-tech fantasy ground, roll D20 type game. These things are getting better. Once it gets to the point where you can run your game, where you're doing what you're doing in New York. You're in New York, right?
I'm in Michigan. Michigan,
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I knew you were on the East Coast somewhere.
Yeah.
You're there, I'm here. We can get together and play our game, and it will be beautiful, like some of these other games. Some of these, fantasy games are, where you've got everything spread out before you. Mm-hmm. There's been some people who've tried, and I've seen some dabbling, but this is where I think the real future of this hobby will be. The reason you haven't seen it, my feeling is, it just doesn't have the numbers at this point. The game companies, they run a hack and slash or a first person shooter. They can get how many millions of players. Yeah. They look back at role playing and go, yeah, so what? 500,000, 1 million, who cares? That's nothing. So once they realize that can be, figure out how to monetize that, where you can you can make skins for your characters that look like your characters, and then the detail work will be beautiful, and the creatures will all work. So it makes it so I can input my campaign, and then it runs for me, and I might even be able to participate. This is where I think the future eventually will be. And I've seen it coming, because I've talked about it, like I said, for as long as computers have been around, that this is going to happen. Mm-hmm. The only reason it hasn't is nobody looks at it as a moneymaker. And the other thing is the technology, isn't quite, I think it is there, actually. It's just that nobody wants to put it to play. I'd love to I keep saying I'm trying to weasel a job into Blizzard, because I want to get the ear of them, to try to get them to do things I want to do and see if they'll do it. But as my friend just says, who works there, it's like, yeah, but they don't get out of bed for less than, $20 million. So it's kind of like, it's hard to change, a thematic. You have to get people like Matt Colville, Matt Mercer. I'm going to butcher his name. I think it's Joe Mangiano. He's an actor. He was on True Blood. Yep. His wife is a famous actress, and he loves Dungeons and Dragons. And he was out showing his wine cellar, which he turned into his dungeon room. You got to make it cool. You can't have people hiding in the shadows. When they realize that this is fun, it's super beneficial. I beat my dyslexia because of games. Mm-hmm. That's when it'll change. When mothers realize, oh, this isn't some evil demonic thing. This is my son learning morality and learning, how the world works and how politics works, and not becoming a dupe of, something else. That it will become bigger and better. And I think that'll eventually all be in the internet at some point. Like I said, it's just when somebody goes, hey, I've got a driver, I've got an engine, I've got a plan, and it comes out there. And because of the work that we're setting up now, the work that Matt's doing, it'll be more receptive, because Matt and Matt Mercer, as you said, we've had a 50% increase this year from last year, or last year from the year before. Yeah. You see a couple more years like that, and I think you're going to. It won't be long till somebody goes, hey, let's do this. And, the first ones will be like EverQuest. They'll be rough, and they'll be a little, or Ultima Online, where they're not going to be quite great. But then it'll be Diablo, and from Diablo it'll become WoW. And then obviously you can pick the myriads of MMO type things that exist. But they'll have that true role-playing experience. Love WoW, not a role-playing game. Love all these games, still not role-playing. But once that comes where I can park my adventure into this system, and you can play it, and 1,000 other people can play it, one thing, it allows someone to monetize it so people can do that, and allows companies to make money. That's what I think the future will be. I hope to live long enough to see it. I'd love to even participate in it, but I think I'm the stepping stone. And I think Matt, Coville, and everyone, we're pushing that envelope forward. And you are too. The more all this gets out there, the more people who listen, the more people who get excited about it, go to a con, get involved. And you might have some tech who's now working at a new game company, and he says, hey, wait a minute, we could do that. And like I said, you'll suddenly see something pop up. That's what I'm dreaming of. And I think it'll seriously get there. Maybe my days of painting miniatures will end, and they'll all just be in a museum somewhere.
No, you'll be painting them in the computer game. You'll be in the computer game, and you'll be painting them there.
maybe. Like I said, I'll be glad to have a nice game center and museum that I can retire away to and just run games daily with people who come in to see the old codger. So.
Yeah, I think with technology is definitely going to help with the tabletop games. Like, they already have like the Microsoft table, so that when you look at the table, it shows a 3D representation of something going on the table. So like augmented reality, virtual reality, and these type of games can help with tabletop games or board games that are going to do that. I've seen Harebrained Schemes had one where they had a light pin that they'd sold in the box, and you use the pin and touch the base of the miniature you were moving around, and then on your tablet it was doing all the fighting and calculating of hit points and stuff. And I was like, so it's already little pieces of technology coming in to buff it up. So I think we're in this cool zone of innovation coming, but real storytelling. Everything's real strong storytelling right now too, which I think is important. It's not so much about just mechanics and I have this cool mechanic. It's about I have this cool story, and I might have come up with some cool mechanics to drive the story that I'm looking at. So
well, the mechanics are easy. Mechanic is just the way the gravity works in the world, and it's just a matter of you picking the one you want, and that's all. I mean, game systems are the real value in any sort of RPG game is the story and the drama and the content and that feeling you get at the end. And that's the thing you don't always get in games, is that when you finish up an adventure, especially what I love is when everybody wants to run out afterwards and sit down and have pie and coffee and talk about the adventure for hours. That's when you know you had a super successful game. Or, like I said, I ran a game, nobody could get to it after the second. I ran the second game, they were like, can we play next week? I mean, they're like, we're ready to play tomorrow type of thing. That's what you want. You want that level of, God, that was so good. And that is where RPGs step over everything else. Doesn't matter how beautiful it is if the story is kind of like, yeah, okay. But if it's great. Blizzard was the first that kind of made it sort of feel like an RPG, and that helped. And as more we get into that, I think you'll start seeing more and more of that pop up. And I think there'll be a whole niche genre. And I don't think the gaming world really realizes how Matt may open them up. I don't think people expect it. There's been a lot of board games that have suddenly come out that have gone well over $1 million. Once companies start to see that, wait a second, are you kidding me? Matt put out a thing that he's promising to stream and produce a nice little book, give you some t-shirts, some really cool stuff, and he gets X amount of dollars. Well, we can do better or bigger or whatever. We'll do something with our stuff and we'll see where it goes. And then you're not worried about, well, we only have a 4-year lifespan and then the game becomes, obsolete or 10 years or whatever the game is. You're going to be sitting, when you get a format set up, it'll go on, indefinitely. Because people want to keep playing role-playing games. I'm living proof. I can dig up stories from well over 40 years ago and tell you about characters and how they heroically died or won or whatever. And that's still the mainstay. And my friends who were there still talk about that like it was real. And we've had storied lives. I've done all kinds of wonderful things. And still the most important thing that happened was in the role-playing game. So what does that tell you? It tells you that this is going to be a format that's never going away. And as long as people look to support it, it's going to just keep getting better. Yeah.
All right. So I was thinking maybe we'll end off with some rapid fire little questions that are just things about Jim. I think these are like, so right now, Dungeons and Dragons, what's your favorite class to play?
Bard.
Love it. What is your favorite historics game to play?
Currently Bolt Action.
I love Bolt Action. That's a really good one.
I do too. It's fun and fast, and big miniatures make it look bitchin'. So.
Yeah. Right now, what's your favorite miniature you've painted so far?
Oh my God.
Yeah, I knew I'd get you on one of them.
Favorite miniature I painted? I had a character I painted years ago called Liam of Keys, and it's kind of a cute story. and it was my favorite pick. I had really stepped above my level. Well, one of my other friends, Don's a painter. When he got together, he kind of copied it, found the miniature, quickly duplicated it, so it looked sort of like mine. And then we were sitting there and we were playing, and I turned around and he had swapped miniatures off. And he goes, "Oh my God, Jim, you got hit by a trap." And he picked up a hammer and he smashed the miniature. And I was like, "What?" So that was more likely the funniest story how to miniatures. It was one of my favorite miniatures. Up till then, I'm always painting. I usually don't have particularly a favorite, though I do have some Sioux that I paid for Tecumil that look really slick, and I really like those. But nobody but me is going to appreciate them.
Love it. What is your favorite right now fantasy RPG that you love to play?
That I like to play?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to give you a cop-out answer. And then I like whatever anybody will play.
Mm-hmm.
I would have to say that my fall 2 has always been the fantasy trip, but it's been dead for so long that we're playing a highly modified version.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, I sent a letter out to Steve Jackson saying, "You really need to hire me and bring me on board, because I doubt anyone knows this game anywhere near as well as I do." But, people are always reluctant to have somebody else come in with their own opinion. So I don't hold my breath on that, but I would love to do it. But it's a great game because it's so very simple, yet you can vary and really make your characters as diverse. I mean, like I said, we play, and it's possible to never see the same type of character. And when he had to change it over to GURPS, I thought it lost a lot in the changeover. But that's because he had to change it to not get sued. But yeah, I would say that would be the two things. But 5th edition's not bad. I'd still rather see 4th edition, but nobody cares about that. But me and Matt and a handful of other people. So.
Well, it's nice that you can still play those. It's not like those go away and you can't play them these days. You can still just.
I know, but you know what? You got to
out.
keep step with everything else, or you become the curmudgeon who's there says, "Get off my lawn," type of thing. So.
Awesome. All right, and then to round that one off, what is your favorite science fiction role-playing game to play?
Traveler.
Nice.
I would love to play. I'm trying to get a group together to play The Expanse. I don't know if anybody watches sci-fi and sees The Expanse. The Expanse is a Traveler campaign. I mean, the guy who must have made it, that, and I thought that Firefly was a Traveler. These guys have had to have read Traveler.
Yeah.
It was more fun to generate the characters almost than play the game, but I love Traveler as a sci-fi game. There are other games out there that might be better, but Traveler was fun. But I'd love to run an Expanse game.
That's the one that captures you.
Nice. Of Traveler.
All right, let's finish it off with a couple of GM questions. What's your favorite creature to put against your players?
What level?
Mid-level. That kind of anywhere from that 5 to 10-ish.
More than likely anything in the elven realm, drow or elves. Nice. I like humanoid characters combination type situations, but I run a very big one. I mean, I was going to give you my pat answer. My favorite monster is the Sturgy, but but it falls apart a little bit at 5th level. At 5th level, geez, I'd have to throw 40 of you. Not that I don't already have 40 Sturgies, because I do, but that's my favorite creature. I love things that look simple and look easy, but turn into very challenging encounters. I made a quote one time, and Matt liked it. It was like, beat a party with a beholder, big deal. Beat a party with a pack of goblins, it's an epic. And that's it. I've always run, I try to run under power level and beat the players with a little sophistication, as opposed to trying to make them, anybody can throw a dragon in a party. And then it's like, well, maybe they make it, maybe they don't. But it's much different when you're doing shambling mounds and all the interesting creatures.
Yeah, you named my favorite one. Is we're really
What's
close.
that?
Yeah. Displacer Beast. I just love the Displacer Beast. And you said you sent 2 of them at him. I was like, yes, that's my favorite.
They're very good. They're very good.
I love them. I love the look and
Well,
everything.
they're very interesting because they change anything that changes the game mechanic is a fun monster. And Displacer Beast, everybody's fighting with a disadvantage if they can't hit it. The minute they hit it, it breaks.
Mm-hmm.
If you throw a spell at it, if it makes it save, it takes no damage, even if it's a half damage spell. It's a good creature.
Yeah.
And it's not so high level. It's a good creature for mid-level.
Yeah, super fun. Well, you have been an awesome sport answering all my questions. You've given us some great stories. I hope everybody goes from here. This will be up on YouTube if you happen to miss it. For those of you that are in the Twitch chat, I put Jim's link to his YouTube channel in the chat there so you guys can go over. He's got several videos up. He's just getting started in YouTube, but he's putting up stuff already that's really good, really helpful for people. He answers comments all the time too, or you can get a hold of him at Game Methuselah. And I think there's an underscore in there. We'll put that in his Twitter because he's very active with his community that he's starting to grow. He's starting to grow his community just like I'm growing my community and Matt grew his community. And we're very interactive. So this is a good time if you want to talk with us or ask questions or just share stories with us. And we're about encouraging new GMs, especially if you're going to run games and you need some help or you just need some advice or whatever, send it to us because we want to help you get started and into this hobby that we love so much. Jim, you have the floor. Anything else that you would like to say as we head out?
I don't want to make any shameless plugs. I'm just going to sign off on my usual moniker. So anyway, out there, fight me devils, fight, for I hate peace. Everybody game on, and if you need to get in touch with me, find me on Twitter or YouTube. Glad to talk to you about gaming. Hope to see you at a game convention. And thank you very much for having me on your show. I really appreciate getting out there and talking about gaming. It's the most fun I have with my clothes on.
Thanks. All right, guys. So we're going to close it out here pretty quick. Remember to be back next Saturday, and we'll have the show run again. Jordan will be back. We'll be bringing on more guests. There's lots going on. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in the next Saturday morning D&D show. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks again, guys. Have a good day.